Here's why you need to master emergency landings. You'll probably want to dominate emergency landings because they are an FAA requirement, but you'll also quickly come to love practicing them. They're fun, and you'll develop some good solid airmanship skills as you learn what to do if your engine ever quits. Here are some cliches to set the stage for you. It's better to hit the tree at the other end of the field at 5 knots than the one at this end of the field at 55 knots. Usually the best place to land when your engine quits directly below you. Roads often have ditches, fences, and power lines next to them. When your engine quits, you should probably switch tanks. I know that's not possible in a 152, but most other airplanes it is. Your order of priorities are to aviate, navigate, and finally to communicate. Two things you can't use are altitude above you and runway behind you. And finally, any landing you can walk away from is a good landing. Landing into the wind is good. Let me do some arithmetic for you. The stall speed of a Cessna 152 with full flaps at sea level on a standard day is 43 knots. Suppose you have a gentle 5-knot breeze. If you land into the wind, you can land as slow as 38 knots. If you land with the wind, you can land no slower than 48 knots. Your airplane would have 59.5% more kinetic energy if you made a downwind landing than if you made an upwind landing. By the way, kinetic energy is the kind of energy a hammer has when it hits a nail. In a 10-knot wind, the difference would be an amazing 157.9%. That's a lot of energy to do damage with. So I hope you're passionate about landing with the wind. Here's another reason too. The ground roll required to stop is proportional to your ground speed when you touch. I'm not trying to tell you that you should immediately point into the wind the moment you decide you're going to land, no matter what you do. After all, you do glide farther with the wind than against it. If you can, give yourself enough altitude to turn into the wind before you land, but first you have to know the wind direction on the surface. Don't forget that when you're cruising along at 6,500 feet, when your engine sputters and dies, you may, almost certainly will, be flying in different wind than the conditions on the ground. So, how to know the wind direction so you can use it to your advantage? Well, you can look to the surface for conditions that tell you which way to land. Here's a short list of telltales to make your job easier. Vegetation. Water. Winds tend to form with their peaks perpendicular to the wind, but move with the wind. Smoke and dust, of course, give it away. Another way to know is to use the techniques you use in ground track maneuvers and flying the traffic pattern. So how do you use the wind to your advantage? We've already decided that most of the time we would like to land into the wind, but if you had a choice between a downwind landing on the Bonneville Salt Flats and an upwind landing across the furrows of a freshly plowed 400-foot long field, you probably let the wind blow you to the salt flats. Ideally, you would let the wind blow you where you want to be, then turn into the wind to land. Now that your airplane is a low-performance glider, let's look at how to get the most out of that glider. A Cessna 152 Pilot's Operating Handbook, also known as the manual, tells us that the best glide speed with the propeller windmilling, flaps up, zero power, and no wind is 60 knots. This means that for every foot of lost altitude, you'll get the greatest possible number of feet forward through the air. This does not mean that you'll get the maximum number of feet across the ground. So, how you can quickly guess the best glide indicated airspeed. You're not going to have time to calculate the best glide speed when the wind's blowing, and the wind is always blowing. So let me set you up to make some quick decisions. We know that in still air we want to go 60 knots indicated airspeed as far as possible. Now suppose you're flying directly into a 60-knot headwind. Well, that's not as bad as if the wind stays at 60 knots all the way to the ground and you have a spot as big as a parked airplane to land on, you'll come down like a helicopter. One thing is clear, you'll have to go faster than 60 if you want to move forward. You can generalize by saying that if you have a headwind, you must go faster than the best glide airspeed to go forward the maximum number of feet across the ground for every foot lost. Now, suppose you have a 60-knot tailwind. You'll want to take as much time as possible descending to let the wind blow you as far as possible. You'd want to slow nearer to your minimum descent rate airspeed, which is always slower than the best glide, and is probably about 50 to 52, depending on the weight of your Cessna 152. You can generalize by saying that if you have a tailwind, you must go slower than best glide, but faster than minimum descent rate airspeed to go forward the maximum number of feet across the ground for every foot of altitude lost. Here are some rules of thumb for optimal over-the-ground airspeeds. If you have a headwind, add about half of your estimate of the headwind to the best glide airspeed. If you have a tailwind, subtract about half of your estimate of the tailwind from the best glide airspeed, but never go below minimum sink rate airspeed. So you may ask, if the manual says best glide is 60, why does it recommend 65 for emergency landings? Glad you asked. You cannot extend your glide by adding power. At the best glide airspeed, you will go fewer feet forward for every foot lost if you either speed up or slow down, which means you have no way of extending your glide. But if you're at 65, 5 knots above glide speed, you can extend your glide by slowing to any airspeed that is the same or faster than the best glide airspeed. Note that when you are sure you've made it to the field, the manual says, and I agree, use flaps, full flaps if you can, and slow to 60. So, which field is best? One that is most like an airport. I'll guarantee you that at some point your flight instructor will pull the throttle to idle while you are on downwind and say, emergency landing. If you can, use the airport. Many will start looking for a likely cow pasture to land on. At least that's my experience as a flight instructor. And by the way, I did the same thing when I was a student. While streets and roads look like airports, they often have power lines across them, telephone poles next to them, cars on them. Rarely a good choice. Cow pastures are good because they are rarely plowed, so they have hard surface, and they are usually more than 1,000 feet on a side. It is essential that you be able to glide to whatever field you pick, and the best answer is that it depends on the situation. So which field is best? If you lose power on takeoff, you'll most often decide to land straight ahead because you won't have enough altitude to turn without stalling, and you may have usable runway ahead. Remember that running off the far end at 5 knots or even bouncing across a golf course is better than spinning in. If you have turned crosswind, you may be able to execute a downwind landing. If your engine fails on downwind, by all means land on the active runway. Don't forget to declare an emergency and tell the tower what you're going to do. She'll move the other airplanes out of the way as soon as you declare, and leaving you alone to fly your airplane. If you lose power over farmland, look for a pasture. If you lose power over farmland, look for a pasture. Certainly a crop field is better than an orchard. A crosswind landing that is parallel to the furrows is probably better than an upwind into the furrows that could flip you upside down. Okay, suppose you lose power over a layer of clouds. Let's hope you have the required instrument training when this happens. I recommend to go to full flaps, straight ahead slow flight, until you either break out of the clouds or contact the ground. Over water? Be sure to open the doors, among other things that will be discussed soon, before you touch down. So let's look at engine failure, from engine failure to sitting under a tree. You're cruising eastbound VFR at 7,500 MSL when your engine quits. First, you diagnose and fix, if you can, the problem. Fuel valve on either, both, or a tank that has fuel in it. Try one magneto at a time to ensure that both magnetos have not been grounded out through the switch. Check mixture to see if it's properly set. I saw one slowly vibrate out for the engine and for the engine to lose substantial amount of power before we saw what was happening. Check the primer to see if it's fully in and locked, and attempt a restart following the checklist. If it restarts, use carb heat to see if the carburetor was icing up or had water in it. Maintain altitude as the airplane slows to 65 knots indicated airspeed while you're doing all of this. Issue a mayday before you lose so much altitude that no one can hear you. Call on 21.5 megahertz. Set your transponder to 7700 or to the current emergency code, which I believe is still 7700. State your problem. Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is Cessna 12345. I am a Cessna 152 with engine failure. My intentions are whatever they are. I am 3 miles east of the XYZ Vortac. I will land on a field directly below me. Start a spiral to the left, because you're sitting on the left seat, at best glide airspeed. In other words, you're going to go to 60 at this point. Execute this maneuver just like a descending turn around a point. Note the wind direction as you descend. While flying directly downwind, break out of the spiral and fly the downwind leg, base, and final legs of a traffic pattern. Change your procedures as little as possible. As much as possible, fly the pattern like you always do, but set up to land a little long if there are any obstacles to pass over. At this point, you are committed to land unless your engine suddenly roars to life. By the way, the steeper the descent in a traffic pattern, the more accurate you can be in landing where you want to. Once you pass your intended point of landing on downwind, put out 10 degrees of flaps. Remember that your most important goal is to land where you want to. This task takes precedence over everything else. To prevent fires, close your fuel valve, put your mixture to idle cutoff, and turn off your ignition switch. Do not turn off your master yet. You need the power to operate your flaps. Turn base when your intended landing point is no more than 45 degrees over your left shoulder, perhaps a little less. On base, put down the next 10 degrees of flaps to a total of 20 degrees. Don't put down the next 10 degrees of flaps until established on final to give yourself more glide path control at the last few moments. Diligently fly your best base leg perpendicular to final to get an accurate reading on the wind speed. If you appear to be too low on base, turn final a little early or retract the flaps to 10 degrees. I prefer to turn early. If you appear to be high on base, then turn final a little late. Once established on final, maintain 60 knots indicated airspeed and extend full flaps as soon as you know that you'll be clear of all obstacles. If you are still too high on final, slip. No reason at all that you can't slip with full flaps. No, but be sure to push your nose down when you slip. Turn off your master switch to minimize the chance of fire. Unlatch the doors to make exit from the airplane easier. An emergency landing is a rough field landing. Since all rough field landings are attitude landings, don't full stall it in. The brakes are more effective when your main wheels are on the ground. It's a stupid statement, but it's true. So hold the airplane off the ground just long enough that you are certain that you will land with the mains and not on the nose wheel. Once you are on, maintain a constant pitch attitude and do not push forward on the elevator control. Brake heavily. Once stopped, get everyone and the fire extinguisher out. Oh, by the way, while you're braking heavily, pull back on the elevator control all the way. You have learned that every emergency is different and there are no hard and fast rules. How to set up priorities during emergency and the effects of upwind versus downwind landings. How to determine wind conditions on the ground and only to deviate from normal landing procedures when you must. How to pick a field to land on and how to pick a best glide airspeed for the conditions. Detailed procedures needed to set up for an emergency landing.